in the good old days when you found sitting incumbents literally, it seems like, colluding, coordinating with neutral election supervisors, that would be kind of considered scandalous, you know? But in the United Corporations of America, just another day at the office. For those of you that remember Debbie Wasserman Schultz, she was the DNC chief that helped the DNC in 2016 rig the primary for Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders. She then had help, I guess, rigging her primary against Tim Canova. If you recall, Broward County, which her district is in down there in South Florida, the supervisor of election broke election law in destroying paper ballots. A federal judge ruled that the supervisor of elections had broken federal election law by essentially destroying paper ballots in the race that Debbie Wasserman Schultz had versus Tim Canova. You're supposed to preserve the paper ballots if you are a supervisor of elections. This election supervisor, Brenda Snipes, who was forced to resign, did keep her pension, though. Isn't that great? Tossed away any evidence of election fraud. That's why you keep paper ballots. Tim Canova lost, I believe, by 14 points in 2016, which at that time, for a relative no-name, was not a huge amount to lose to a longtime incumbent. And his campaign had accused Debbie Wasserman Schultz of getting significant help and of basically rigging the vote. So they demanded to see the paper ballots to see, did they really lose by 14 points? But the paper ballots were nowhere to be found. Sorry if I'm giving you PTSD from 2016. So again, she had to resign in pretty much disgrace. Not Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but the election supervisor. But, and the new supervisor of elections that came in said, I'm doing things differently, this will be a neutral process, blah, 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 blah. So this time around, Debbie Wasserman Schultz is facing a progressive challenger. Why does this matter? Because we have, we know Republicans try to rig the vote, but how do you actually change things? How do you make this a more progressive country if you cannot, in all circumstances, whether Florida, whether any other city or state, if you cannot have faith that every election, primaries, state primaries in Congress, primaries in Senate, presidential primaries, are credible, have integrity. Well, we know in 2016, a federal judge ruled the supervisor of elections, who was supposed to be neutral, was basically rigging it for Debbie Wasserman Schultz. By the way, if you've never seen this, this is who the supervisor of elections was in 2016, the one who had to resign in disgrace. Does anything in this picture I'm about to show you look a little funky? So this was the supervisor of elections in 2016, sitting there posing with Debbie Wasserman Schultz during a campaign event for Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the neutral supervisor of elections, who then destroyed paper ballots. So it kind of seemed like a big effing deal to me when somebody sent me this message earlier today. Where are you? Debbie Wasserman Schultz emailed this out to her supporters. Do you have election questions? Please join me Friday, August 7th at 10 a.m. So tomorrow, 10 a.m. for a Q&A session with Broward County Supervisor of Elections, Peter Antonacci, and Miami-Dade County Supervisor of Elections, Christina White. If you have questions for the supervisors, email them to blah, 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 blah prior to the event. We'll ask some of the most relevant questions. If you want to watch the event, it will be streamed live to my Facebook page at 10 a.m. on Friday. So, why does this matter, you might ask? Well, again, the supervisor of elections in 2016, who illegally destroyed paper ballots and was forced to resign, No, she wasn't sent to jail, even though what she did was illegal. Yes, she was able to keep her pension, even though she illegally destroyed paper ballots. The new supervisor of elections is literally holding an event with Debbie Wasserman Schultz 1 day before early voting begins down in South Florida in Debbie Wasserman Schultz's district. 11 days before the in-person primary between Debbie Wasserman Schultz and progressive challenger Jen Perelman. What's interesting about this is I combed through Wasserman Schultz's Facebook, her Twitter, couldn't find this invitation. So essentially, from what I could gather, Debbie Wasserman Schultz emailed this to her supporters. So it is obviously inappropriate, especially in a district that, again, the previous neutral supervisor of elections had to resign after illegally destroying paper ballots. It is very, very suspect and inappropriate why the current supervisor of elections would agree to join basically a campaign event for the longtime sitting incumbent. Now, the supervisor of elections, he would be free to do whatever kind of events he wants to inform voters of the different options, of the fact that early voting is now open, of mail-in ballots, of ways that you could socially distance while voting. That would be the job of the supervisor of elections by themselves, not in a joint event with the sitting incumbent, oh, by the way, 1 day before early voting begins. I don't know, call me cynical Susie, but it kind of gives off the impression of impropriety. I reached out to the supervisor of elections asking, I don't know, being that your predecessor narrowly escaped jail by illegally rigging the election for Debbie Wasserman Schultz in 2016, should you be joining the sitting incumbent on a live stream answering election Q&A questions? Because to me, her primary challenger, Debbie Wasserman Schultz's primary challenger, Jen Perelman, isn't invited to this public meeting. So how is it a public meeting open to everybody if one candidate, the longtime sitting incumbent, is hosting it? Her challenger isn't involved. And the neutral election supervisor, who, frankly, he's not the one who destroyed the paper ballots, but he is the supervisor of election in an area with a track record for election integrity issues. So I reached out saying, isn't this kind of like electioneering? Isn't this kind of like giving off the impression that you're kind of like working with one candidate versus the other? So this is what I got back from Pete Antonacci. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Yes, we feel it is appropriate to participate in public forums with sitting elected officials. We pride ourselves on being accessible, transparent, and accountable. Yeah. So, first of all, this is not a public forum. Technically, to the letter of, I guess, technology, it's public because it will be on Facebook and live. So, I guess he could get away with saying this is a public forum. But this isn't in person because there's a pandemic and Florida is a hot zone. So it's online. The back end of this is controlled by a candidate, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. She is hosting this quote-unquote Q&A on the elections 1 day before early voting starts. I wonder if Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the election supervisor will be telling the participants and the viewers of this quote-unquote Q&A, early voting is tomorrow. But again, Debbie Wasserman Schultz has not promoted this on Facebook, on Twitter. As far as I know, this has only been sent out to her email list of her supporters. So again, when the supervisor of elections, Pete Antonacci, says to me, we feel it is appropriate to participate in public forums with sitting elected officials. Again, how is it a public forum if the only way of knowing about this is if you are on Debbie Wasserman Schultz's email list? I've gone through her Facebook for the last 2 weeks. Nothing about this. Twitter, same thing. It's not a public forum. It's basically a virtual election Q&A. The longtime sitting incumbent is hosting, inviting the neutral supervisor of elections with basically only Debbie Wasserman Schultz's email list recipients knowing about it. Basically, it's a campaign event rallying her base to start sending in their mail-in ballots and to early vote, with the supervisor of elections joining. Does corruption exist anymore? Do conflicts of interest exist anymore? This isn't about just Debbie Wasserman Schultz. This is about election integrity. This is about fraud. This is a district that, again, just 4 years ago had the supervisor of election, I hate to be a broken record, illegally destroying paper ballots, which are meant to be backup sources to make sure that the count that's going out is accurate. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing that this is happening in broad daylight. I sent it around to journalists today. Other than Ryan Grimm with The Intercept, most of them didn't respond to me or didn't even share this. I even sent it to progressive media. They didn't share it. I asked some follow-up questions, and the supervisor spokesperson told me, sorry for the confusion. We are not hosting the event. We are invited, and as with as many invites as we could manage, we accepted. So I wrote back, that's kind of a distinction without a difference. Actually, I think it's a little worse that you're not hosting it and you're just joining one candidate's event. The supervisor of elections should not be attached to any events with candidates. They are supposed to supervise the election. They are supposed to basically be godless when it comes to candidates. If Pete Antonacci, the supervisor of elections, wants to hold a digital Q&A informing Florida's 23rd district voters how they vote, when early voting is, how you could do a mail-in ballot, all those things, have at it. That would be great. But that's not what's happening here. This is a virtual meeting hosted by Debbie Wasserman Schultz without her opponent partaking with the supervisor of elections. That's coordination. The follow-up questions I sent to Mr. Antonacci were not responded to. Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.